What I want to do right now is go through the first part of the testimony that we have on Treblinka. And most of the testimony breaks down into two witnesses. Franz Suchomel, who was part of the German command at Treblinka, organizing and undertaking the mass killing at Treblinka. And also the other witness is Abraham Bamba. He's one of the Jewish survivors, and he was one of the barbers who undertook the haircutting of the people right before they were executed. So first I want to go through Franz Suchomel and go through how do we establish certain things as being reliable. But also the other key element is to why does it matter? And remember, that is really the analysis, the critical thinking matter. And this is what historians do. They always have to establish what happened. And you always got to be aware of that your witnesses might or might not be telling you really the whole story. And you've got to go through and establish what went on and whether or not this person or that person is reliable. And there are ways to do that. And so you've got to always ask questions about, is this reliable? Because remember, you never really establish absolute truth. We can't establish certainty, but we can get a level of reliability. And the other thing we have to go through is go through and establish, why is this important? That is the analysis. And everybody should go through it and do their own analysis. And generally, you'll come up with an insight of what really went on and why does it matter. Okay, so let me go through the testimony of Suchomel. And one of the things you'll see from the start is that they are recording this without Suchomel's knowledge. Now, some people might think, oh, well, he has a right to privacy. Well, he was part of a mass murder, and the hundreds of thousands of people were murdered. So I would argue that no, maybe Lanzmann was very justified in recording his testimony without his permission. But that's something to keep in mind. Suchomel is speaking in a manner that he doesn't think this is going to come back to him at all. That's something that Lanzmann's doing to show that this is probably a bit more reliable. And then watch what he does in the first few minutes. And it seems like it's a throwaway moment, but watch what he does with it.
Marschieren vom Bahnhof zur Arbeit. Für uns gilt heute nur Treblinka, was unser Schicksal ist. Drum haben wir uns auf Treblinka eingestellt in kurzer Frist. Wir kennen nur das Wort der Kommandanten, ohne Gehorsamkeit und Pflicht. Wir wollen weiter leisten, bis das kleine Glück uns einmal winkt. Hurra!
Now that might seem like a throwaway moment. Why is Lanzmann walking him through an old song they used to sing back then? But think back to when he did that with Simon Treblinka. And those songs that Simon Treblinka was singing, and he had been singing those as a 13, 14-year-old boy, those were not the songs that a 13 or 14-year-old boy would, memorize. Those were the songs soldiers would have taught him how to sing, because they were from the perspective of soldiers returning home after the war. Now, with this song, number one, he remembers the lyrics. He's not making them up as he goes along. That's kind of difficult. But one of the things about song lyrics, most of you are aware that they stick with you for a very, very long time. And Suchomel here can recall these lyrics in detail. And that kind of tells you a lot, that this was actually a song that was taught to the Jews once they arrived at Treblinka. So, and then if you look at the actual lyrics in the song, we want to serve, to go on serving. Once again, you're seeing something that echoes something you saw with Simon Treblinka. Do you think the Jews would sing songs or make up songs where they said, we want to serve and go on serving, especially when they're at, an execution camp? Well, no, of course not. That's unreasonable. These are clearly songs that are taught to the Jews who are about to be executed by the Germans and the other guards. You're going to hear about Ukrainians and Latvians and others who were making them sing these songs. So that tells you that this is probably pretty reliable. You never have absolute certainty or absolute truth, but you can get a degree of high reliability. And I would say that this moment, what Lanzmann's demonstrating, is that Suchomel actually does remember things quite well. And he is a quite reliable witness as he goes through things, because he remembers this. And then you want to ask yourself, well, why does this even matter? These are just song lyrics. Well, these are lyrics, and watch what until a little luck ends it all. That would be the Jewish executions. Jews wouldn't sing that. It's really a sick joke played on the Jews by the Germans, the Latvians, and the Ukrainians. It really shows how these Germans, Latvians, and Ukrainians had dehumanized the existence of the Jews. It's right before they were going to be executed, they were being mocked. So it shows you the distance that the Ukrainians, Germans, and Latvians had, and these are the ones undertaking the executions. The distance they had from them, they had treated the Jews as if they weren't even human, that they could mock them on the way to their death. That's the importance of it, okay? And let me take this a little bit further and go a little bit up a little bit to the processing. And you'll get these moments where it seems like he's just, giving throwaway bits of information. But all of these, if they're analyzed properly, you can find whether or not they're reliable and how important they are. And let me go a little bit ahead to the processing, okay? This is around 420.
Wie war es möglich, im Treblinka, im Spitzentage, 18.000 Leute.
18 ist zu hoch.
Ich habe das in Bericht gelesen.
Ja.
Now let me stop it there for a bit. What Lanzmann's asking him is how did you kill 18,000 people per day? But notice that he uses language of processing. That is to not confront Suchomel with the fact that he's a mass murderer. So he says processing 18,000 people. And he got this number from court records. In one sense, Lanzmann is using what would be considered by most historians to be a reliable record. And what Suchomel does is says, sure, but then he dismisses that number. He says it's not accurate. Now, as a historian, you are confronted with conflicting testimonies. You have Lanzmann's testimony saying he got it from court records and it's 18,000. And then you have Suchomel saying, no, that's too high. Well, this is a historian's issue. Whom do you believe? In one sense, you might think, well, obviously I'm going to, take the side of Lanzmann because he was, not, killing thousands and thousands of people. That's clearly, I wouldn't want to believe Suchomel. But I'm going to say, take a look at Suchomel for a moment here and see where he's coming from, because number one, he does not know he's being recorded. He doesn't know this. So he doesn't have a compelling reason to lie, unlike other people you're going to come across. So watch as he goes through this.
18.000 Leute zum Behandeln, zum Liquidieren.
Herr Lanzmann, das ist zu hoch gegriffen. Glauben Sie mir das?
Wie viel?
12.000 bis 15.000.
Now let me stop there. He puts the number at 12 to 15,000. Notice that he does not make himself look good. When he does this, when he says 12 to 15,000, not 18, well, murdering only 12 to 15,000 doesn't exactly make him look good. But he's going to talk about the difficulties that they ran into as they were murdering so many people. And it sounds a lot like somebody on a job running into the realistic difficulties of actually getting something done. I'll tell you on this, I actually do believe, and I really want to emphasize, in the end, you have to see whom you really believe. Do you believe the court records? Well, there's certainly good reason to believe them. They weren't, put together for just light and transient reasons. Or do you believe Suchomel? Well, believing Suchomel does not make you really side with what the Nazis did, but it makes you listen to somebody who is actually there, who is not trying to make himself look good, because he goes through all the difficulties that they ran into orchestrating this. On this one, on the factuality of it, I would actually see Suchomel as being more reliable than the numbers that Lanzmann comes up with. Is Lanzmann not telling the truth? I wouldn't say that for a second. He's using court records. I think he's being responsible. But in the end, I do think Suchomel is probably more accurate. Probably. I really want to emphasize there's no absolute certainty on this. I think they were murdering 12 to 15,000 based on what he goes through and what he describes. Okay, and that is just the historian's skill of trying to establish reliability. But notice I don't dismiss Lanzmann for a second. I think he has a very reasonable, case. I cannot examine those court records. What were they based on? But based on what I have in front of me, Suchomel's testimony, it seems if he had reason to lie about it, he wouldn't do it if he were hidden. Since he's hidden, he seems to want to tell the truth. And he does seem to want to impress Lanzmann with how hard it was on him. Okay, so that's what I want you to be aware of when you're trying to establish reliability. Because if you look at many of the other witnesses, they are outright, almost certainly, covering things up because they don't want to come to terms with what they were a part of. Suchomel doesn't know that he's being recorded. Okay, so let me jump up a little bit. And he goes through all the difficulties they ran into and things like that in the trains. And so please remember with this is something I mentioned earlier when we had regular class time, is there are people out there who are trying to deny the Holocaust. In light of the testimonies that we get here just in Shoah alone, that's horrendous. Those people who are trying to make you question it or to deny it, those people are clearly motivated by a racist ideology. This undeniably took place. And the numbers, the daily numbers at Treblinka, whether or not they were 12 to 15 or 18, that is honestly not as important as the fact that hundreds of thousands of people were murdered here. And the idea that millions of Jews were murdered is not a stretch at all. That's highly reliable. So that's historically reliable. So let me go up ahead to the funnel, and let me jump up a little bit further. Let's get all the way to the funnel. This is up on the 12-minute point. And what they refer to...
Können Sie diese schlau, ganz Bescheid schildern?
Ja.
Wie viele Meter, wie
Der Schlauch,
wie waren die Leute in diese Schlauch?
der Schlauch war ungefähr 4 Meter breit.
Das ist
So wie dieses Zimmer.
wie dieses Zimmer.
Beiderseits waren so hohe Wände oder so, war so hoch.
Mauer.
Nein. Stacheldraht. Und in den Draht war hineingeflochten, so dicht, Zweige von Bäumen, von Föhren. Verstehen Sie mich? Waldbäume.
Let me stop it right there for a moment and go back a bit. And he says here, the first thing Lanzmann does is he establishes the room. And Suchomel's very detailed. I believe what he's saying here because he seems to have very clear memories about the gas chamber and about the rooms and as they led them up to the room. So he's very clear about it. And then when he gets up a little bit, on each side were walls this high and this high. No barbed wire. And that's Lanzmann asking, no barbed wire, why not? And Suchomel says, woven into the barbed wire were branches of pine trees. And you've got to think for a second as a historian, is this reliable? And then why do this? I do believe Suchomel on this testimony. Again, number one thing, he does not know he's being recorded. And he also is very insistent that it wasn't walls and that the barbed wire wasn't readily apparent, that in fact there were branches of pine trees. Why do that? And he goes through it, and when you go through the whole testimony, it seems that they were all putting on a performance essentially to make it seem like nothing really wrong was going to happen. They wanted the Jews to cooperate, to go through with it. You're not going to your death. We're just going to, take care of this. We just want you to go in here to take a shower in this, and this. They seem to have covered up all the very threatening elements of the gas chamber so that the Jews were not fully cognizant. They could figure things out. They kind of knew. But the Germans and the Latvians and the Lithuanians all seem to have orchestrated a process that gave Jews a reasonable way to believe that they're not going to die. So as they did this, the branches of the pine trees were woven into the barbed wire so that it didn't seem so threatening to the Jews. That's why his testimony seems so reliable to me, is he's talking very clearly about how they orchestrated everything that the Jews had to go through to get the Jews not to believe, really to be convinced that you're about to die. Because if they did that, they would start to have resistance from the Jews, have them to believe that maybe you're going to live just a little bit longer, and then you can get their cooperation. That's why I think his testimony is reliable, but also so important. Okay, so I'm going to hold off right there. I'll cut it a little bit shorter than 20 minutes. But also you're going to see when he starts talking about the road to heaven, that's a term that Bomba uses also. And so you get the fact that these two are not working with each other, but they kind of disagree on things. And that tells you that this language was probably used. They only sort of remember similar things, but they sort of disagree. The road to heaven, or the funnel, this was language that was used by both the Germans and the Jews. Okay, so that tells you that this is probably reliable. Okay, so I'll hold it there, and that's what you get from Suchomel. And be aware that there is constantly this orchestration of keeping the Jews or giving them a level of deniability, but also having the Jews in direct contact with the other Jews as they were being sent to their executions. Okay, so I'll stop it there, and then I'll come back to Bomba's testimony in a bit. Take care.